It was Friday night, and the neon lights of the hideaway cast their electric blue and pink glow across the crowded room. I remember checking my reflection one last time before stepping through those heavy wooden doors into what felt like another universe. The bass was already pulsing through my chest as I squeezed my way inside, my heart racing with that familiar cocktail of anticipation and anxiety that comes with venturing out alone. The hideaway wasn't just any gay bar. It was an institution in our mid-sized Midwestern city, a sanctuary where, for a few precious hours, we could all just be. I'd been coming here for about 6 months since moving to town for a new job, still trying to find my footing in a community that sometimes felt just out of reach. Let me take you back to that night, a night that started like so many others but ended up changing something in me. The air was thick with cologne, sweat, and possibility as bodies moved and shifted through the limited space. It was what we called the Friday rush, that magical hour when the afterwork crowd blended with the night owls just starting their evening. I hadn't planned on going out that night. After a particularly brutal week of deadlines and office politics, my couch and a Netflix documentary had been calling my name. But there's this restlessness that sometimes takes hold, a need to be seen, to exist in spaces carved out for people like us, spaces our parents and grandparents fought for. I made my way toward the bar, mentally rehearsing my drink order as I navigated through clusters of friends and couples. The hideaway had this horseshoe-shaped bar in the center of the main room, allowing the 3 bartenders to serve the constant flow of thirsty patrons from all angles. It was strategic positioning on my part to head for the corner of the bar, less crowded, better chance of getting served quickly, and the perfect vantage point to observe the room without feeling too exposed. That's when I first noticed him. He was perched on one of those high bar stools, one leg casually draped over the adjacent empty seat, not in a territorial way, but more like he was simply comfortable taking up space. His profile was illuminated by the backlit bottles behind the bar, strong jawline, slightly tousled dark hair, and the hint of a 5 o'clock shadow. He wasn't conventionally beautiful in that intimidating, Instagram filter way, but there was something magnetic about how he seemed completely at ease in the chaos. He was wearing a simple navy button-down with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms decorated with what looked like a geometric tattoo. I couldn't help but notice how he nodded along to the beat of the music while scanning the room, occasionally smiling at something he observed. I'm not usually the type to approach strangers. Years of subtle rejections and not-so-subtle homophobia in my hometown had installed a caution system that rarely disengaged. But something about that night, maybe it was the particularly good song that was playing, or maybe it was the second wind I'd caught after my initial hesitation to go out, made me feel just brave enough to drift toward that empty half-bar stool. As I got closer, our eyes met briefly, and he smiled, not the dismissive acknowledgement you often get in these spaces, but something warmer, inviting even. He shifted slightly, moving his leg from where it had been resting on the empty portion of the seat. I took this as my cue. Mind if I squeeze in? I asked, gesturing to the half-vacant stool. The music was loud enough that I had to lean in closer than I might have otherwise. It's all yours, he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. Though squeeze is the operative word. He laughed, and I felt something in me relax at the sound. I hoisted myself onto the stool, immediately aware of how the design of these seats forced a certain proximity. Our thighs pressed together out of necessity rather than choice, and I prepared myself for the subtle shift away that usually follows such contact between strangers. But it never came. Instead, his leg remained firmly against mine, a warm presence that seemed to grow more significant with each passing minute. The bartender approached, and I ordered my usual, a whiskey sour, not because I particularly loved them, but because they took time to make and gave me an excuse to linger. My Barstool companion raised his nearly empty beer in a silent toast before taking the last sip. "Another IPA for you?" the bartender asked him. "Why not? And put his on my tab too," he said, nodding toward me. I started to protest. I've never been comfortable with strangers buying my drinks, a boundary established through less pleasant experiences, but he shook his head. "Consider it rent for the half seat," he said with a wink that somehow managed to be charming rather than sleazy. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Alex," I replied, extending my hand in what felt like an oddly formal gesture for a bar. But he took it, his grip firm and lingering just a beat longer than necessary. Thanks for the drink. And the real estate. Real estate in this place is prime on Fridays, Daniel observed, surveying the increasingly packed room. You picked a good night to come out. There was something about the way he said it, not loaded with innuendo, but genuine. I found myself relaxing into the conversation, the initial awkwardness of sharing such close quarters with a stranger gradually fading. I almost didn't, I admitted. One of those weeks where my couch was calling my name louder than any bass line. But here you are, he said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me momentarily forget the chaos around us. Something must have pulled you out. I could have given him the simple answer, that I was bored, restless, or just following the Friday night social script. Instead, I found myself telling him the truth. Sometimes I need to remember there's a community out there, that I'm not just floating alone. His thigh pressed a little more firmly against mine, and I couldn't tell if it was intentional or just a shift in his position. Either way, I didn't move away. There was something comforting about the contact, like a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. I know exactly what you mean, Daniel said, his voice dropping slightly so that I had to lean in closer to hear him over the music. I moved here from Buenos Aires 3 years ago. The first 6 months, I barely left my apartment except for work. It was my cousin who finally dragged me here, said I needed to find my people. The revelation of his origin explained the accent I couldn't place, Argentine Spanish softening his English in a way that made even mundane words sound somehow more meaningful. As we talked, the bar around us seemed to recede. The music was still pounding, people still shouting over it to be heard, bodies still brushing past us to order drinks, but it all became background to the bubble we were creating. Our conversation flowed from where we'd grown up to our jobs. He was an architect working on sustainable housing projects. I was in marketing for a nonprofit, to our favorite spots in the city, to the books and shows we'd recently consumed. With each new topic, I became increasingly aware of how our bodies remained connected. His thigh never moved from mine, a constant warm presence that anchored me to the moment. There's something uniquely intimate about physical contact that persists without acknowledgement. It creates a secondary conversation beneath the spoken one, a dialogue of pressure and warmth, of subtle shifts that either increase or decrease the connection. Throughout our talk, Daniel's leg remained steadfastly against mine, occasionally pressing more firmly during moments of emphasis or shared laughter. So what's the story with the tattoo? I asked, nodding toward the geometric pattern visible on his forearm. It was partly genuine curiosity and partly an excuse to maintain our conversation, which had reached that comfortable rhythm I didn't want to break. Daniel rolled up his sleeve a bit further, revealing more of the intricate design. It's based on a Mapuche pattern, indigenous Argentine art. My grandmother was Mapuche, and she used to weave these incredible textiles with similar designs. He traced the lines with his finger, and I found myself following the movement, mesmerized. Each pattern tells a story or represents something in nature. This one, he pointed to a particular section, is about connection and finding your path. It's beautiful, I said, genuinely impressed both by the artistry and the meaning behind it. I've always wanted a tattoo, but could never commit to a design. That's the thing about permanence, Daniel replied, his eyes meeting mine again. You have to be sure. But sometimes, the things we're most certain about aren't things we can see or touch. He paused, taking a sip of his beer, like the feeling of belonging somewhere. You can't wrap it up or put it on a shelf, but you know it when you feel it. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. That's why spaces like this are so important, I said, gesturing around us. They're physical manifestations of that feeling. Exactly, Daniel agreed, his expression brightening at being understood. In Buenos Aires, we have this concept called encuentro. It's more than just meeting someone. It's about the meaningful collision of lives, even if just for a moment. As he spoke, I became acutely aware of how our encuentro was unfolding, not just in conversation, but in the persistent connection of our bodies. His thigh remained pressed against mine, neither of us acknowledging it verbally, but both clearly conscious of it. It wasn't sexual tension exactly, though there was certainly attraction there. It was something more fundamental, a human connection, skin to skin, in a world that often keeps us isolated despite our hyperconnectivity. The bar had grown even more crowded as the night progressed, the music shifting from upbeat pop to deeper house beats that seemed to match the more intimate turn our conversation had taken. Someone jostled Daniel from behind, pushing him slightly more into my space. He steadied himself with a hand on my shoulder, the touch brief but electric. "Sorry about that," he said, though he didn't move back to his original position. If anything, we were now sitting closer, our sides aligned from shoulder to knee. "It's fine," I assured him, surprised at how comfortable I felt with this new proximity. Occupational hazard of Barstool sharing. Daniel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You know, in Argentina, we have much less concept of personal space. The first few months here, I was constantly apologizing for standing too close to people in line or greeting new acquaintances with kisses on the cheek." "And now?" I asked, curious about how he'd adapted. "Now I've learned to read the room," he said with a slight smile. "To recognize when someone might welcome closeness versus when they need their bubble." There was a question in his statement, an opening for me to define where I stood on the spectrum of comfort with our current situation. I could have shifted away slightly, establishing a polite boundary. Instead, I found myself leaning in a fraction more, our shoulders now firmly pressed together. "I think bubbles are overrated," I said, surprised by my own boldness. "Especially on nights like this." Something changed in Daniel's expression then, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of lips. He held my gaze for a beat longer than casual conversation warranted. "I couldn't agree more," he finally said, his voice lower than before. The bartender interrupted our moment, asking if we wanted another round. We both agreed, and as Daniel turned to pay, I felt a momentary coolness where his body had been pressed against mine. It was remarkable how quickly I'd grown accustomed to his warmth, how noticeable its absence was even for those few seconds. When he turned back, drink in hand, he seemed to deliberately resume our physical connection, his thigh finding mine again as he settled back onto the stool. There was an intentionality to it now that hadn't been there before, a choice rather than circumstance. "So, Alex," he said, my name sounding somehow special in his accent. "Tell me something you've never told anyone at a bar before." It was a bold request, skipping past the usual small talk into something more substantial. I considered deflecting with humor or a superficial revelation, but something about the night, about him, made me want to offer something real. "I write poetry," I admitted, feeling a flush of vulnerability. "Nothing published or anything. Just for myself. It's how I process things." Daniel's face lit up with genuine interest. "What kind of poetry? Do you have a favorite poet who inspires you?" The fact that he didn't dismiss it or make the conversation about himself touched me. Mostly free verse about everyday moments that feel significant somehow. And Pablo Neruda, actually. I read him in translation, but there's still something magical about his work. "Neruda," Daniel repeated, his pronunciation much more authentic than mine had been. "He's a national treasure for us Latin Americans. I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees." The quote hung between us, charged with meaning. I was impressed he could recall it from memory, and moved by the selection, one of Neruda's most romantic lines. "You know his work well," I observed, trying to keep my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. "My mother was a literature professor," Daniel explained. "Our house was full of books, and she would read poetry aloud during dinner. Neruda was her favorite too." He paused, taking a sip of his drink. "Maybe someday you'll share some of your poems with me." It wasn't a question, but an expression of hope, for continuation, for future encounters. The implication that this night might be the beginning of something rather than a self-contained experience made my heart race. "Maybe," I replied, not wanting to commit, but not wanting to close the door either. "If you're lucky." Daniel laughed, the sound vibrating through his body and into mine where we touched. "I'm already feeling pretty lucky tonight," he said, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made the crowded bar seem to fade away. The music shifted again, this time to a song I recognized and loved, a remix of an 80s classic that had been reclaimed as something of an anthem in spaces like this. Without thinking, I started moving slightly to the beat, my shoulder brushing against Daniel's with each movement. "You want to dance?" he asked, nodding toward the packed dance floor. I hesitated. Dancing meant leaving our little bubble, entering the fray of bodies and movement. It meant losing the intimate connection we'd established in favor of a more public interaction. "I'm actually enjoying our conversation," I admitted. "And this seat was hard-won real estate, remember?" Daniel nodded, seeming pleased with my answer. "True. Though I have to confess, I'm curious what kind of dancer you are. I think it tells you a lot about a person. What does it tell you about yourself? I asked, deflecting his implied question back to him. He considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. That I care less about how I look than how I feel. That I'm willing to be a little ridiculous for the sake of joy. He shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. Dancing is like a temporary surrender of control, you know? A willingness to be moved by something outside yourself. His description resonated with me, touching on why I both loved and feared dancing. That's beautiful, I said honestly, and a little terrifying. The best things usually are, Daniel replied, his thigh pressing more firmly against mine as he shifted to face me more directly. Being vulnerable always comes with risk, but without it. He trailed off, leaving the thought incomplete. Without it, we missed the chance for real connection. I finished for him. His eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by how perfectly I'd captured his thought. Exactly, he said softly. We fell into a comfortable silence then, both sipping our drinks and absorbing the atmosphere around us. The pressure of his leg against mine had become so natural that I almost forgot it wasn't normal to maintain such persistent contact with someone you'd just met. Almost, but not quite, because every few minutes, my awareness of our connection would surge, sending a pleasant warmth through my body. Can I ask you something? Daniel said after a while, his tone more serious than it had been. Of course, I replied, curious about the shift. What brought you out tonight? Really? You mentioned needing to feel connected to community, but was there something specific? The question caught me off guard with its directness. I took a moment to consider my answer, wanting to be honest without oversharing. Today's actually the anniversary of when I came out to my parents, I finally said. 5 years ago. It didn't go well initially, though we're in a better place now. But every year on this day, I feel this. I don't know, this need to affirm that decision. To remind myself that choosing authenticity was worth it, even with all the complications. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That makes sense. Anniversaries have a way of bringing things back to the surface, good or bad. He hesitated before adding, I'm glad you chose to celebrate it by coming here tonight. The implication that my decision had led to our meeting hung in the air between us. Me too, I said simply, allowing the weight of those two words to convey what I wasn't yet ready to articulate. Daniel's hand, which had been resting on the bar, moved slightly closer to mine. Not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. My coming out was different, he offered. Very anticlimactic. My sister had come out 2 years before, so I think my parents were prepared. But I remember that feeling afterward, like I needed to be around people who understood without explanation. Exactly, I said, grateful for his understanding. It's exhausting sometimes, having to constantly explain or justify your existence to the straight world. In spaces like this, you can just be. And yet, here we are, still explaining ourselves to each other, Daniel observed with a small smile. Just in a different way. A chosen way, I corrected. That's the difference. He nodded, acknowledging the distinction. A chosen vulnerability. The phrase lingered between us, perfectly capturing what was unfolding. We were choosing to reveal ourselves to each other, piece by piece, all while our bodies maintained that steady, grounding connection. As the night progressed, our conversation deepened. We discovered shared passions for travel, though we'd been to completely different parts of the world. Daniel told me about growing up in Argentina during economic turmoil, about his decision to move to the States for graduate school, and the complex feelings of being caught between two cultures. I shared stories about growing up queer in a small conservative town, about finding refuge in books and art, about the chosen family I'd built over the years. Throughout it all, our physical connection remained constant. His thigh pressed against mine became a kind of anchor, a physical manifestation of the emotional bridge we were building. Occasionally, one of us would shift position, and for a brief moment, the contact would be broken, only to be deliberately re-established seconds later, as if neither of us could bear the separation for long. The bar had begun to thin out slightly, the initial rush giving way to a more manageable crowd. The music had softened too, allowing conversation without having to lean in quite so close, though we continued to do so anyway. What time is it? I asked suddenly, realizing I'd completely lost track of the hours. Daniel checked his watch. Just after midnight. Why? Do you turn into a pumpkin? I laughed at the Cinderella reference. No, just surprised. It doesn't feel like we've been talking for that long. Time is funny that way, Daniel mused. It expands and contracts based on who you're with. There was a question forming in my mind, one that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The night was winding down, and soon we'd face the moment of decision, to exchange numbers, to extend the evening elsewhere, or to let this encounter remain a beautiful, self-contained memory. Before I could formulate the question, Daniel spoke again. I live just a few blocks from here, he said, his tone careful, neutral. I'm not suggesting anything specific, but I have a balcony with a great view of the city lights and a much better selection of drinks than this place. If you wanted to continue our conversation somewhere quieter, the invitation hung in the air between us. I appreciated his directness and the space he was leaving for me to define what continuing our conversation might mean. His thigh remained pressed against mine, neither increasing nor decreasing the pressure, maintaining the status quo while I considered his offer. I'd like that, I found myself saying, the words emerging before I'd fully processed my decision. But as soon as they were out, I knew they were true. I wasn't ready for this night to end, for this connection to dissolve back into the anonymity of city life. Daniel's smile was warm, relieved. Great, he said simply, finishing the last of his drink. No pressure, by the way, just conversation. And maybe some of that Malbec I've been saving for a special occasion. Is this a special occasion? I asked, emboldened by his obvious interest. His eyes met mine, serious despite his smile. I think it might be, he replied. Encuentro, remember? The meaningful collision of lives. As we gathered our things and settled our tab, I felt a momentary pang of nervousness. Was I being impulsive? Naive? But then Daniel stood, and for the first time since we'd started talking, our physical connection was fully broken. The absence of his warmth against my leg felt wrong somehow, incomplete. As if reading my thoughts, he placed his hand lightly on the small of my back as we navigated through the remaining crowd toward the exit. It was a gentle, guiding touch, respectful but clear in its intent to maintain our connection. The cool night air hit us as we stepped outside, a refreshing contrast to the warmth of the bar. The street was alive with people moving between venues, the energy of the city's nightlife in full swing. Daniel's hand dropped from my back, but a moment later, his fingers brushed against mine, a question in the contact. I answered by taking his hand, our fingers intertwining naturally as if they'd done this many times before. The simple act felt monumental somehow, a public declaration of the private connection we'd been building all night. It's this way, Daniel said, nodding down the street. About a 10-minute walk. Is that okay? Perfect, I replied, squeezing his hand slightly. I could use some fresh air. As we walked, our conversation continued, but there was a new ease to it now, as if the decision to extend our time together had removed a layer of uncertainty. Our joined hands swung slightly between us, a physical pendulum marking the rhythm of our steps and words. I don't know what the rest of the night will bring, or what tomorrow might look like. But I do know that something significant happened on that shared barstool, a connection that started with the incidental touch of strangers and evolved into something deliberately maintained, consciously chosen. In a world that often keeps us isolated despite our constant digital connections, there's something profound about the simple, analog act of maintaining physical contact with another person. His thigh never moved from mine throughout our entire conversation, a silent affirmation that he was present, that he wasn't pulling away, that the space between us was one he wanted to eliminate rather than preserve. As we turned the corner onto his street, the city lights spreading out before us just as he promised, I'm struck by how a night that began with seeking community in the abstract has led to this very specific connection. Sometimes belonging isn't about finding your place in a crowd, but finding that one person who makes you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And sometimes, that journey begins with nothing more than a shared barstool and a thigh that never moves away. Total _char_count, 18,770.